No remorse, no mercy, no forgiveness. Not a single step back, not a single moment of hesitation. You will not succumb to fear or doubt, and you will relent only after you have given your last moment for the Emperor. Nothing less than this will be tolerated. I have often spoken about the curious balance in how the verse of 40k is described to us versus how it should on paper more plausibly exist. There already exists an understandable disparity between its different categories because Warhammer 40,000 can be purely about the written lore and world building, it can be the tabletop game, it can be about the art of painting, and more often than ever it is expanded through video games of increasing budget and quality. Games Workshop has also begun in one form or another developing its own shows, and there remains the ongoing speculations surrounding the development of the Cavill supported series. But just whether or not that will ever come to light is a whole thing in and of itself. A show in production is by no means a show guaranteed to be delivered. Case in point was the full announcement way back in 2019 of a show stated by GW as being in production. They even gave a full press release announcing it was Eisenhorn, then to never be mentioned again. I think it could be fairly speculatively assumed that it was since cancelled, but that was never commented upon anywhere officially. Anyway, that's really off the topic, but it was an interesting aside to probably expand upon separately. The issue is that with all of these different avenues into 40k, it's common people could enjoy all of these things, or just singularly, or in various combinations. But when considering a verse as complex and lore-rich as 40k, spread across all of these different formats, what remains an ever-present challenge is maintaining not only its continuity, but also the correct scale and plausibility of its world building, that it feels tangible, and that's what I want to speak about today. Because for as insane or bonkers as 40k can be, as I've said previously, 40k straddles this line between remaining serious and somewhat plausible, and then also straying into orcs teleporting smaller orcs inside of living guardsmen who would then proceed to burst out from said guardsmen in a frenzy. Then you also have the Tau, who are apparently holding out against the Imperium despite maintaining a tiny percentage of the Imperium's military strength. But let's not overthink the fact that the Imperium could just crush them with a couple of committed fleets because, the Tau have got tactics, and that counts for so much. Plus, yes, some other conditions which have protected them. And this is despite the fact that the Imperium's entire spiel is sending wave after wave of my own men at them until their engines are clogged with the dead. But apparently when it comes to this specific area of the galaxy, they've just decided to kind of cast it off to one side. Anyway, I really should talk about the Tau soon, separately as well. But this is often what comes to my mind when I think about the scale of things in 40k, by which I mean, is X scenario remotely reasonable? Admittedly, most often of course the answer is no. But far from being too over the top and massive, which would often be people's automatic assumption, it's actually the opposite. Because bizarrely, a lot of descriptions and scenarios in 40k are in fact severely underestimated, which may be surprising. One of the best examples, and that I'll talk about, is the numbers involved in the conflicts seeming almost absurdly below anything that you would expect. This to me is a considerable flaw, because it really breaks the immersion, almost more than anything else for me. And I can usually handle that if there is an adjacent, semi-plausible rationalization to gravitate to, then I'll take it. But very often when it comes to the scale of materials, manpower, or a war itself, there's very little to explain why, because mentally you're projecting these scenarios, these battles, these engagements, these long campaigns like the Heresy. You're laying that out you're stretching it over the framework of 40k, and if it doesn't fit, it just feels wrong. It's similar to me in how, using CGI in movies, your brain can tell the difference between whether something's being done with miniatures and models and maybe a little bit of CGI to just blend it all together, or whether it's all CGI. And very often, that is a big turn-off for people. And it's why recently, a lot of very big movies are gravitating back towards using miniatures in some respect, and again, maybe some CGI to just blend it together, because it feels more correct, it feels more tangible, it connects more with the audience. And that connection is really, really important in terms of being pulled into a verse. And continuity is one thing, but the scale of a world and how it feels and fits together is on par there for me. And I think those examples are comparable. I think your brain knows when you're talking about a planetary battle over hive cities involving like thousands of ships and deployments, but then when we're talking about battles with hundreds of thousands, it just kind of doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel right because your brain knows that there should be considerably more units on the ground for any kind of battle that's being described at that scale. And again, as I just said, often little to explain why that kind of aspect is not rationalized, which is what you need. Initially, when I was considering speaking about the scale of 40k, I was primarily thinking in terms of these military deployments, the logistics, the production, training and deployment of units, and how these are illustrated and represented to us. Inevitably though, the more you rake over a topic, I always find you begin to unearth additional thoughts, questions, and areas of interest, and this subject was no exception. Now, just before we get to the issue of plausible scale in 40k, I think one of the largest ongoing questions when it comes to Warhammer 40,000 is your chosen level of suspension of disbelief that you wish to engage and apply to it, which is of course always an individual decision. And while I choose to approach 40k from a more serious, thoughtful perspective, which I fully understand is in many respects itself somewhat ridiculous, many others sit on the polar opposite end of the scale, which is of course also 100% fine and valid. Some people don't take it seriously in any shape or form. And sometimes I've seen people be very unhappy about that massive gulf of difference in terms of how it's interpreted. But this is very much true to the core nature of what 40k is and what makes it so broadly successful through to how it continues to grow and bring new people in. 40k can be many things to many people. It's always been my opinion that it must continue to carefully balance these component areas in order to function at its best. And this means that almost by design, it cannot be entirely dry, serious and grounded, which is something that I fully understand. But it also cannot be just fluffy. It cannot be too silly, over the top and just cartoonish. And of course the quality of new material counts significantly. There is a balance to strike in the tone and detail of the 40k verse, and striking that balance is difficult. To my mind, attempting to find the sweet spot comes from maintaining a strong continuity, by ensuring the lore is only worked upon by those with a strong, vetted understanding of it in its entirety, which, generally speaking, Games Workshop does appear to do by only handing off big advancements to major authors. And even then, if you see Dan Abnett's list of thanks for additional input, say, within the End of the Death series, it's a very collective effort of many authors and contributors. Plus, historically, and in recent times, Games Workshop is seen to keep a pretty tight leash on new material for the most part. We're certainly nowhere near the ridiculous nonsense you see in pop culture when it comes to take your pick of any Hollywood franchise, where you have people coming in and they almost wear it like a badge of honor, saying, yeah, I don't really know anything about this series, but I'm looking forward to putting my own mark on it. It's mind-blowing, and we've seen multiple franchises crash and burn as a result of bringing people on board who have absolutely no clue what they're talking about or what they're doing. But the other consideration for me is also the pace of development. As I've said before, the glacial speed of advancement for 40k lore is understandably painful for me, but it also means we don't tend to see abrupt changes that are badly planned and then have to be stupidly retconned. There you go, I said it this time. And when we talk about this, we're thinking of things like the chrono adjustment around the Dark Imperium, and this was actually one of the most significant adjustments ever, which would have been horribly jarring if it wasn't so masterfully woven into the non-existent canonicity of 40k. And where we end up with now in terms of chrono strife and the chronology is that effectively, and they've done this very deliberately, that in M41, Guilliman is basically saying, yeah, you could be 1,000 years either way. It's a very good way of them maintaining the idea that we could be at the end of M41, and it also makes it difficult to pinpoint when things happen, so they can keep the end of where 40k is at very sort of vague and broad to just keep it rolling forward. Anyway, whenever I get into one of these very obsessively and arguably entirely unnecessary analytical topics, it's important to understand that this is my fun. And that's something I think sometimes people don't realise, because this is the stuff that I sit thinking about. The boring stuff is the fun stuff for me. And I trust you all just actually accept and understand that at this point, because I enjoy digging into the details and thinking, does that make sense? Does this small irrelevant mechanic work? how would it work? Why wouldn't it work? And that's even with my full awareness that ultimately what I'm considering has little bearing or relevance upon anything other than it being for my own enjoyment as a thought experiment. I enjoy very much thinking about things that don't matter. At the same time, when it comes to suspension of disbelief, I'm not so stubborn as to believe that this is not a necessary mechanic when it comes to a world such as 40k. You can call it whatever you want, suspension of disbelief, a hand wave, or just being plainly dismissive. There exists a need in any science fiction or science fantasy verse for both writer and reader to agree we both know this is something that cannot be explained. But it's also necessary, so let's just put it over here in the no further questions pile and not come back to it. This is something that is common and entirely accepted by degrees within fictional verses. And for those who haven't heard the term before, such structural mechanics of a verse often determine whether it's classed as being soft or hard science fiction. Soft means it usually contains more things that are fun and interesting for storytelling, but stretch the believability of how plausible or even possible it would be in terms of the actual science and context of a setting. Something like Star Wars and Star Trek are good examples, despite the fact that both can be approached or depicted with a fairly serious perspective if one chooses to. And especially in the case of Star Trek, with it leaning toward the scientific and the exploration, but both are littered with things that either can't be easily explained or just using faux made-up science or just fundamentally don't make sense. And as a viewer, we accept that these are to be ignored and understood. Universal translators, transporters, holodecks, the list is just endless when you drill down into the mechanics. But we accept that this is a fun, interesting part of the verse, it makes it work, it's enjoyable, and so you give it a pass. But then you switch to something like The Expanse, which despite of course still containing some aspects that require us to stretch the imagination a little, it does its best to maintain a sense of being as grounded in reality as possible, and that's something that I really enjoy. But 40k is very strange in the sense that it contains some elements that are certainly more in the fantasy sphere, but also maintains elements of hard science fiction where it attempts to explain function, purpose and context of many in-fiction devices, objects, structures, logistics and so on. Yet it also maintains parallel to this soft elements, which exist wholly within the no further questions necessary sorting pile. So what really is my point here? Well, obviously today I'm talking about things in a more serious perspective, but I just wanted to add some context that we are fully aware that essentially within the 40k verse, a lot of this stuff exists as a suspension of disbelief. But when it comes to the scale of populations, the deployment of the militarum, the battles which occur, this isn't really something which I would consider as needing to be classed as sort of hard science fiction. It doesn't need to be so strictly grounded. But the disparity exists so much that I don't think it can be passed off with a suspension of disbelief either. And that is why this is a problem for me. And I thought it was very important to clarify that, because I really think you need to understand that to kind of qualify why I'm bothering to talk about this in the first place. So, let's just come right out with it. One of the most jarring things in 40k for me is the reasonable scale of deployed forces. And this can be actual theatres of war through to quoted numbers of PDF, Hive Militia, or a good example would be the numbers offered up by Krieg on the return of the Imperium. How many Krieg soldiers did they offer that apparently blew the Imperial commander away? 60k. 60. Not 600. 60,000 soldiers. Here's the quote. What is the current fighting strength of your Death Corps? At present, we can offer the Emperor 60,000 soldiers, trained, equipped, and organised into 20 regiments. The statement was met by a brief, stunned silence. Then, the Lord General Militant leaned forward in his seat. You did say 60,000, 20 regiments. This is one of the crazy things about 40k, the inconsistency in scale. And it is inconsistent because sometimes it can be very large and other times not. In some novels or supplements, it can speak about numbers like 500 million PDF. It will then also talk about 1 million elsewhere, even down into hundreds of thousands. And part of the problem is that over decades of lore, it's very clear that in the past, nobody was really thinking too hard, or it seems, about the numbers. And after many years of people in the audience likely taking jabs and discussing about how silly it is, they seem to have started adjusting the numbers more recently. And one other interesting thing to note, it was announced today that they're actually creating a new novel around the Siege of Vrax, which of course already exists in the Imperial Armor series, but now it's also going to be a standalone novel from Steve Lyons, who also did the previous Krieg book. So it's going to be interesting to see how this new interpretation of Vrax deals with the sense of scale. But in terms of the more contemporary references to numbers and the scale of battle, that is now problematic in itself, because it only highlights past examples even further for just how underscaled they are, making it all the more comical. However, I say that, but in the pretty recent Krieg lore, the book that was not even 2 years ago, and they're still quoting these numbers of 60,000, and that would be fine if those were just the numbers they had at the end of the Krieg situation. And the numbers are not really the problem. The problem is these 60,000 Imperial Guard being enough to stun into silence a Lord General of the Imperium. Now, I suppose you could rationalize and argue it by saying, well, he was just surprised that the Krieg world, which they thought was completely destroyed, was offering up any amount of guard. But that's not how it feels. It feels like he is just shocked that this is a massive number of guard. It's really going to make a big difference for him. Whereas it's really nothing in the context of the broader galaxy and the Imperium and the kind of numbers of Imperial Guard they should be regularly dealing with, which should quite honestly be in the tens of millions. So this to me is immersion breaking, because it doesn't really gel, it doesn't really make sense. Despite the fact that at this point the Imperium believed Krieg to be a ruined world, as I say, it's just a drop in the ocean in terms of unit size. And additionally, this stands adjacent to one of the questions I see most often, which is, how does the Imperium maintain its forces in terms of numbers? Because in many engagements, especially for the Imperial Guard, they take considerably significant losses. They're permanently engaged in war all across the galaxy, which requires replenishment and redistribution of military resources. Now, the answer to that should of course just be hive cities, because hive worlds often contain multiple hive cities and are talked about as containing human populations numbering multiple billions for each hive city. Yet planetary militia and numbers of Imperial Guard are described in numbers that are not just short of the mark, but so far off what you would imagine them to be that it does begin to stretch credibility. For us looking in, it requires us to force our suspension of disbelief to a place where this should be entirely unnecessary. Hive militia and Imperial Guard regiments being talked about in numbers below anything like 1 million strong, that's not a stretch, it's ridiculous. Especially when you consider, as a simple example, the US had 0.5% of their population on active duty during the mid-80s, but this went as high as 9% during World War II. And Germany itself during World War II, I've seen numbers saying they had anything like 30% of their population enlisted. The reason I mention these numbers is that during war, nations tend to obviously enlist more of the population for service, which of course makes sense. So then, if we're considering the Imperium is entirely focused upon war, it would make sense that a figure like 5 or even 10% of a hive city's population would be pretty standard for enlisting in the militia or guard. So, taking that thinking, for planets that are entirely focused upon military output, this could be significantly higher, 30%, maybe even 40%. If we're thinking of how things in 40k are larger than life, and the fact that many planets are singularly focused on a specific point of production, those are the numbers you would expect. Except this is usually not the case, because whenever you see descriptions of actual numbers in 40k lore, they're nowhere near the kind of figures you would expect to see. We're often seeing campaigns or assaults upon a world involving below 10 Imperial Guard regiments, and it's pretty common that where there are instances of losses, we're often talking below 100k. If we were to consider a normal hive city, as I say, these are often stated as having a population of at least a few billion, up to anything like 10 billion. That's just for a single hive city. Now, when we're talking about taking 10 or 20 or 30% of a population and assigning them to duty, that doesn't mean that the rest of the population are also there just standing for duty. You obviously have older people, kids, those that are working and have to work, and so on and so on. It just means that of that percentage, you can draw enough from the population to make it all work. And you can see this by during World War II, they were still able to field massive numbers of servicemen and basically keep the country functioning. So let's imagine a 40k hive city has 4 billion individuals. That's a pretty medium or even lower end for a hive city. And this is where things get silly, because even if we take an extremely minimal figure of that 0.5% for enrollment in, say, Hive Militia, PDF or Imperial Guard, That 0.5% should yield the Imperium anywhere in the region of 20 million individuals. Yes, 20 million. Not 20,000, not 2,000, not even 200,000, 20 million. In 40k, you never hear of figures like this. And that was with us only assuming a 0.5% uptake from a hive city. 0.5%. It's absolutely nothing, not even for the Imperial Guard, who are the most numerous force for the Imperium within the lore. It's far more common to hear about them described, like I say, in hundreds of thousands, at the maximum maybe millions. If you consider some real-world, albeit very rough, estimated figures, China, for example, population of 1.5 billion, military of estimated 2 million and 500k in reserve, so that's about just over 1% of the total population. In terms of the US, 450k active members of a population in the region of 340 million, so a similar percentage conversion to military service, around, just over 1%, 1.5%, something in these kind of regions. So in terms of what we're considering, it again illustrates how in 40k, the Imperial Guard and just the forces of the Imperium in general should certainly be being described very regularly in the millions. If you're talking about a hive city of 4 billion, 5 billion, and you're taking 1 or just over 1% of that population, that is a massive, massive, massive amount. And when we think about numbers of a population that big being available as a resource in the Imperium, I think one thing that does begin to make more sense is that it always seemed very incomprehensible, these figures that were quoted for the failure rate for those entering in as prospects for Astartes or even Grey Knights. I remember when I described that for every million individuals you would only get 1 Grey Knight, and some people said that that seemed absolutely insane. But when you start to see the numbers we're talking about just from a single hive world, actually suddenly it does seem a little more plausible and even, makes sense. Nonetheless, the losses are still pretty disgusting, but in the scale of human population for the Imperium, it seems almost acceptable. Something I see often though as a follow-on question that I'll speak about later is the issue related to how on earth does the Imperium replenish its population? Well, firstly remember that the hive worlds have populations in the billions, or for a total planet maybe tens of billions. If it's a dense hive world with many individual hive cities, you could be talking about a planet population of 20, 30, 40, 50 billion people. Because a large majority of populations are comparable in the Imperium to really the late 19th, early 20th century. Their lives are pretty simple as citizens of the Imperium. Work hard, low expectations, likely as many children as you want, and then repeat. Now, another question, of course, is people always saying, well, do they have families? How does that function? What's the deal? Of course, it is very vague. In some respects, the only insight we tend to get is through the Warhammer Crime series, which is why I do recommend that, because that deals with down in the hive cities, the general kind of population. And they do talk about districts which are residential, there is class levels, but in terms of asking, do people have families in the Imperium? Yeah, they absolutely do. You do hear this talked about very regularly. There are some examples of it, albeit very kind of fleeting. But I think, as somebody said to me one time, when your life consists of basically going to work, coming home, and having very little else to do, then certainly families having new children all the time can be pretty easy to happen. Not only that, but I think the concept of having large families for Imperial worlds in 40k is very much that how it used to be in human society, where a lot of the time people had big families just because people were very aware that you would inevitably and kind of sadly lose along the way some of those children because disease was pretty prevalent, work and life was pretty hard, and also people just didn't live as long. And again, that's very comparable to the Imperium. Their lives are pretty straightforward. Work hard, low expectations. Many hive worlds are industrialized but with very poor to moderate living conditions. Yes, they will have some modern mechanical elements here and there, as well as possible vid screens, vox communications, but your basic working class hive citizen is going to be living a life of grinding labour. Because just as in the 18th, 19th and the 20th century, the working populations of hive cities are considered little more than disposable material by the higher class and certainly the broader Imperium. They're often probably seen more as a problem that has to be controlled and maintained than anything. While the machinery of life in M41 is driven largely by human labour in its industry, agriculture and more, they still would easily have vast numbers of citizens to additionally commit to training for the militia and guard. Essentially, there should be very minimal limitations on the number of deployable forces for the base Imperial Guard, other than perhaps the production of materials to equip them, which is a factor certainly. And this is another reason why the humble lasgun serves the Guard so well, for it is durable, easily mass-produced, and not an entirely ineffective weapon. But of course there are many other factors to consider in terms of how a deployed force is supported. But as we enter the next section, if we're talking about scale of war, I want to just round this chapter out with the consideration that not in 40k, but in World War I, the Central Powers, which were Germany and its allies, mobilised an estimated 25 million soldiers, while Britain and its allies, including of course France, Russia, the US and more, collectively brought some 40 million. Now millions would die, not only due to the actual physical engagements, but also massive losses due to disease and other conditions. But again, it just makes 40k look kind of ridiculous when they are often talking about conflicts which are in the low millions or the hundreds of thousands or even sub 50,000 on a planetary assault. But then we have these real world conflicts that took place here on Earth. You're talking about numbers as high as 60 million total. 60 million. And let's keep that in mind when we discuss the battles of the grim, dark, far future, a galaxy of war, of horrors and weapons the likes of which we've never seen nor imagined, with battles that contain, hundreds of thousands of combatants, at least a few thousand casualties. I think the point is made. While there are examples of Imperial wars that have numbers approaching what we might expect, such as the Siege of Vrax, which I think is why people enjoy that also because it's Krieg, but the Siege of Vrax I think was undoubtedly based off of numbers drawn from actual history, given again the combatants involved and what happened there. It's certainly more common that many Imperial planetary wars result in a far more reduced death toll than we might see for a single historical battle or position of contention over years in reality, which again is pretty jarring if you just know history or have any awareness of specific engagements in history. Let's take another one, Octarius for example. Now the total numbers in that engagement in terms of losses unknown, but it's still more common for engagements in Octarius to describe numbers in the thousands than in the millions, which when you're talking about something like Octarius doesn't really tally. The only main instance that actually talks about deploying millions of Guard comes in the Salvation of Sigma Ulstari. But for Octarius, descriptions of the Guard in the millions is really the exception, not the standard, which really doesn't work for me. Then you have the Taros campaign, which saw the Imperium attempt to retake a world, turning to join with the Tau, basically secede. And to counter this, the Imperium launched what was described as a full-scale invasion of the planet, which featured under 10 Guard regiments, and some Astartes. The Imperium would fail, and they suffered terrible losses, below 50,000? This is really the issue when it comes to the lore and deployable forces. In Octarius, you've got millions of Guard being deployed to this, basically a campaign which is lost from the beginning. The Taros campaign, you've got an Imperial planet which is being stolen by the Tau. They deploy a few regiments, some Space Marines, and take 50k losses. It is all over the place. I will say though, there is one solid thing about the Imperial Armour series, and that is the fact that it does actually deal with things like airspace control, logistics. It talks about redeployment, resupply, and you get a better picture of how the actual battles take place. I think we are long overdue for something like the Imperial Armour series, which gives a more grounded, real sense of the conflicts taking place in the 41st millennium, which deals with the logistics, the layout, the structure, the approach of the battle, the theatre of war. But quite honestly, the size of those books, every single book in the Imperial Armour series is at least 2, maybe 3 times larger than most 40k supplements. There has been nothing like this kind of material for a considerable amount of time, nothing like the Imperial Armour series, nothing like the Horus Heresy Black Books series, and there's no sign that that's going to change, which is a really big shame. It's often apparent that the scale of conflicts defies the theoretically available numbers of military force. Within the galaxy of the Imperium, this disparity between the narrative scope and practical realities of war presents a confusing paradox that can really only be forcibly dismissed by suspension of disbelief. But as I say, I personally feel that this is not acceptable here. At the heart of this lies the sheer magnitude of the battles, often visually depicted in the lore, where we see immense clashes between what appear almost infinitely massive armies, vast fleets and hordes of nightmarish creatures. This is actually a significant problem for 40k, because to successfully describe such conflicts is considerably challenging, and this is only made more problematic by the fact that, as I've mentioned before, humans are not good at mentally comprehending the scale of conflict, the materials and losses involved. From sieges which consume entire planets, to sprawling campaigns that span entire sectors, the scale of warfare in the 41st millennium should be nothing short of staggering. Yet, it's often focused down to a far smaller scale, and this is undoubtedly both necessary and deliberate. This is why you see novels focused in more on characters and campaign material taking a broader scope, but it still doesn't explain why in passing references they can't get the numbers more plausible. Consider, for example, the legendary battles of the Horus Heresy, where vast numbers of Astartes clash in confrontations that shook the foundations of the Imperium, or the relentless wars against the Tyranids, where entire hive fleets descend upon unsuspecting worlds, overwhelming even the mightiest defences with their insatiable hunger. When one considers the theoretical numbers of military force available to the factions of 40k, we're faced with often this glaring inconsistency. The Imperium of Man spans 1 million worlds and boasts untold trillions of subjects. Its military might is said to be without equal, with countless regiments of Imperial Guard, legions of Astartes, and formidable war machines. But even among the enemies of humanity also, the forces of chaos, the Xenos races, the myriad of other factions that populate the galaxy, are portrayed as possessing vast reserves of troops and material. The Orcs, with their propensity for endless war and ceaseless reproduction, are said to number in the billions if not more. The Tyranids, ravenous swarms from beyond the void, are said to be capable of consuming entire galaxies. Yet despite these staggering numbers, the battles depicted in the lore often seem to involve forces that are a fraction of what one might expect given the theoretical capabilities of the factions involved. Entire worlds are defended by regiments of Imperial Guard, while Space Marine chapters, each numbering no more than 1,000, are tasked with holding back the tides of darkness. On the Xenos side of things, when it comes to the Orc and the Tyranids, often the maximum you see them described in is in deploying millions, and in the context of the galaxy, millions to a single world is nothing. Now, I can't just go through and list every single battle and engagement ever seen in 40k, but let's take the Second War for Armageddon as another example of a massive conflict involving difficult to estimate numbers of Imperial Guard, plus numerous Space Marine chapters and vast Orc hordes under Ghazghkull Thraka. Now, I mention it as this is an example where the Orcs are talked about in the millions, and the Guard also. It showcased a fairly uncommon magnitude of description of clashing between the Imperium and the Orcs, testing both their resources and resolve. It would leave the planet as we know scarred by devastation. But most importantly, this was a conflict that for once described moderately plausible numbers being mentioned. But I would argue it's still well short of the mark when we consider the numbers of our own 20th century conflicts, where the numbers involved dwarf those described in 40k. So why are the conflicts and numbers described as such in 40k? I think firstly to deliver on the grimdark aesthetic, which prioritises narrative impact over adherence to remaining more grounded. Engagements are crafted to evoke a sense of awe and spectacle, with the focus placed on the heroic deeds of the few rather than the faceless masses of troops that make up the bulk of any military force distributed across an entire planet, or even a specific continental region. Adjacent to that, we also rarely hear described the tactics, the deployment of materials that you would actually see. We don't often hear about airspace control, called-in artillery strikes. Everything is very up-close, personal, not to mention close combat, or it's described very broad but very vaguely. Describing any numbers beyond single-digit millions becomes extremely difficult for people to visualize. By placing the actions of individuals within that scale, it can in fact diminish their impact and importance. Of course, it could also be that they're just not thinking about it too much. But then there's the logistics of war in the 41st millennium, and that should be inherently complex as well. But it remains another largely absent description from many campaigns and missions. but it does feature in some stories, I should note, where we see groups awaiting orders, having to have their orders sanctioned, waiting reinforcements, resupply, and so on. And of course the Imperial Armor series and some of the Black Books from the Heresy series, they do contain more detail than you see in a lot of the more modern or later material. In some respects though, it's okay to not have too much focus on logistics, because just as people don't worry about how Space Marines carry enough ammunition when they're regularly seen to carry just 2 mags max into battle, the tone and nature of warfare that characterises the 40k verse is not focused on the detail of logistics. These are things mentioned in passing while we focus on characters and their story arc. It's the supplements which tend to speak about the wider context, which is why I enjoy supplements. And this is where we learn about resources being more scarce, things needing to be allocated wisely, and the obvious consequences when this doesn't happen. I think the heart of the problem is of course attempting to describe the scale of war itself, and yet still enable it to be relatable to the audience, which is a difficult thing. Because whether it's planet-wide sieges or sprawling campaigns that span entire sectors, the scope of war in M41 should be absolutely epic. And I use the word epic specifically because very often the scale of 40k war is seen best through the franchise known as epic. Armies numbering in the millions clashing in titanic confrontations, while fleets of starships engage in brutal space battles that stretch across entire systems. Again, it's something that is very regularly illustrated via the visual 40k medium, because it's far easier to do it in this format than it is for readers attempting to visualize these battles through words. The sheer scale of the conflict can be very overwhelming. The vastness of the battlefield, the cacophony of weapon fire, the tactical, logistical chaos of combat can not be just difficult to comprehend, but difficult to reasonably describe, making it very challenging to form a coherent image of the action unfolding on a page. As a result of this, many authors choose to focus their storytelling, understandably, on smaller, more manageable units such as individuals, squads, characters, and by closing in on the experiences of these smaller groups, they can provide readers with a more intimate, immersive perspective, craft more focused, tightly paced narratives that should keep readers engaged from start to finish. By following the trials and the tribulations of a select group of characters, authors can maintain a sense of tension, momentum, and ensure that readers remain invested into the outcome of an overall conflict and story, especially when they're engaging in battles, because describing an engagement above a personal level and still maintaining a sense of severe consequence and humanity is incredibly difficult. And I've said about this before, where some authors succeed with this and some do not, because describing battles is extremely difficult to maintain interest and focus. I think that in terms of redressing the balance, as it were, one could argue that it is this compensation that artwork provides. While numbers are just that, the artwork tells us unapologetically, hey, this is how it should look, keep it in mind, and perhaps that's one way we can mentally balance it out. I think that helps me with the suspension of disbelief. But nonetheless, it still never stops me wondering, why the low estimation of numbers when we're talking about Imperial Guard, Hive World Militia, or just general battles scene? Here's a piece of advice: add an extra 0 on the end when you're quoting numbers involved in battles. Just add an extra 0, problem solved. You can still do all that and keep the numbers believable. And again, I could understand it more if the numbers were always low, but they're often low or high or in between, and that's the crux of the problem. It's the inconsistency. So I did want to touch on this issue because I know people will ask the question, so I inevitably have to put this in here. But if you haven't seen it, do go check out my video about industrialized birth and your worth in the Imperium. But the inevitable question is always, how does the Imperium cope with constant wars of attrition and battles that lead to the deaths of human Imperial Guard by the thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions? Well, it's all about my favourite lore thing, context. With additional context, things tend to generally make more sense. Without proper context, you can just twist anything to fit a personal perspective, and that's not what we want here. We want to know what's possible, what's plausible. So the first question regarding reproduction in the Imperium would be something like, Could it occur naturally and still allow them to replace the losses of many millions? And I always see the question, I always see the speculation, do they need birthing factories in hive cities? No. It's always about, would people have enough time and resources to reproduce in a hive city, given the lives of citizens? And to both of these questions, the simple answer is yes. The reason people get really hung up on this is it's never particularly spoken about in the law. And it's really very simple, because whilst this stuff is interesting for law nerds, social issues are not high on the narrative agenda. Although the ecclesiarchy and the religion of the Imperium undoubtedly are a big part of what guides citizens and bonds their society together, not to mention planetary governors and all manner of bureaucracy within a hive world and a planet and a system. Within a working day though for individuals, it's going to be very dependent on the specific world and local edicts. Some worlds are going to allow more time for citizens to just exist, especially if they're more focused on production of individuals for a tithe over manufacturing or a military planet. Most worlds though would incorporate some kind of worship of the Emperor, travelling to and from your factorums, machine preparations, shift changes over, all these kind of things. And just in terms of it being plausible, you're going to have some social time, some familial time in there somewhere as well. But again, to reference back to the 18th and 19th human century, this is how I imagine the lower levels of hive cities, and they're producing the bulk of human material. I think some of you will remember that I've actually quoted some Dickens before at the start of videos, and I kind of tricked people into thinking it was a 40k quote because it sounded so plausible in the context of a hive city, when in fact actually, no, it's just ordinary human history. The descriptions of most things are always extreme in 40k, and I think it's fair to assume that unless you are within a particularly extreme planetary regime, there would be at least some minimal time assigned to workers to allow them a modicum of social time and structure. To not have such things makes very little sense, and it again goes into the extreme view of how 40k is. It's this kind of very caricatured, over-the-top visualization, which when you start to more plausibly break it down doesn't really work. Nonetheless, the life is certainly hard for an average Imperial citizen, especially on a hive world, but they're not penal workers. It doesn't mean they have a life of easy luxury and leisure, but they'll have some crumbs of personal time to scrape together the basics of human life, just enough to prevent people from going completely insane. But let's return to the idea about replenishing losses. It should be obvious that for humanity this is not a major problem. If millions of individuals are lost in a battle, a generic hive world of the Imperium could accommodate multiple hive cities, and so as I described earlier, even when the losses of the Imperium in these massive battles are heavy, they are entirely contextually tolerable, which is again why I never fully grasp why it is they make conflicts so underscaled, because in the context of what we understand of the Imperium, losses of millions can be readily absorbed. In fact, it's not just able to be rationalized, it's almost contextually necessary, because the sheer abundance of individuals for the Imperium largely dictates their approach to war, as the Imperium does not really value the individual, not unless you are an Astartes, navigator, princeps, some role of high importance. In terms of manpower, the Imperium leans into treating its own citizens like ammunition, and despite the tales of glory and honour, writing up the names and their tales for all the citizenry to be inspired by, the approach of the Imperium is not a surgical strike, it's a sledgehammer. That's why the Militarum is described as the sledgehammer of the Imperium, because they inflict blunt trauma. That's the level of sophistication and morality humanity operates within the 41st millennium. Hit it with a lot of people and basically deluge your enemy. So while this complete lack of empathy and morality on the face of it seems reprehensible, it entirely fits and is in fact reasonable for a human civilization existing which has regressed so far into the darkness of the 41st millennium. And let's keep it real, things weren't much better during our own wars of the 20th century. The level of apathy for human life displayed by the Imperium is almost, if not definitely, existing right now in the 21st century. It's just that the Imperium is less disingenuous about it. Returning to the core question though, can the Imperium replace their losses? The answer is basically yes. Reproduction aside, hive cities contain enough individuals and likely surplus citizenry that you could temporarily bolster local forces, draw and extract conscripts, or if the hive factorums required consistently high levels of manpower, other regional planets could be assigned to provide extra support via Imperial tithes until such time the losses could be replaced. And again, we come back to my favourite thing, context, because context says that this is the entire point of the Imperial tithe system in 40k, because the bureaucracy of the Imperium will draw what they need from the areas who can spare it. They will increase the tithe and say, we need more manpower, and they will take that to enable the assistance for those who are suffering. Then collectively, worlds will recover their losses. So there's no weird breeder factories needed. It's just about boring administrative bureaucracy, because that is what the Imperium is all about, boring administrative bureaucracy. It's all about moving numbers around. And when it comes to life in the Imperium, some things do bear a resemblance to a plausible human existence, albeit just a grinding, physically ruining one. There are always going to be weird, extreme circumstances, because it's 40k. But for your average pleb citizen, life is pretty straightforward. Work hard, pray right, don't ask too many questions, have some offspring, and you've served the Emperor well enough. The Imperium of mankind is surprisingly resilient, in fact. It can take heavy blows, it can lose millions, even billions of fighters and citizens, and still replenish its ranks from the trillions of humans across hundreds of thousands of worlds. This isn't to say that it's anything you would describe as stable though. Human error, greed, accidental catastrophes, war, warp travel can and regularly do undermine the effectiveness of supporting trade and material transfer. Not to mention the grinding agony of Imperial bureaucracy. Worlds may suffer from lack of military support, or perhaps a requisition gets filed incorrectly, entire worlds starve and descend into barbaric civil war. Then you have Xenos assaults, warp corrupting incursions. The list is endless. But for me, it's always the context and scale of those wars that make 40k what it is. In the galactic-spanning conflicts of 40k, it's not unreasonable for us to expect the scale of battles to often fluctuate wildly. Conflicts should and do range from skirmishes involving small squads to massive engagements involving millions of troops. This delivers the depth and expanse of narratives we expect in a world as complex and historically extensive as 40k, but it also brings inconsistencies which can be jarring. And I've not touched on many other examples which I am certain you will help me by putting down in the comments below. But this is why I emphasize the importance of maintaining consistency within the lore. There really needs to be a feeling of a more consistent guideline when it comes to the scale of battles to ensure that the narrative remains coherent and grounded enough to remain within the scope of believability. Because doing so enables the audience to immerse themselves more fully in the world and by establishing consistent parameters for the scale of battles. As I've said before, something can still be over the top, crazy and out there, but remain played entirely straight, serious and grounded. Those two things work very well together. It doesn't ever have to be one thing or the other. 40k doesn't have to be entirely serious and very focused on the analytic details of things, or entirely crazy and bonkers and over the top. It's not one or the other. They can be both things at the same time. The alternative solution, of course, is to permanently keep the scale of battles vague, allowing readers to then make their own interpretations based on the narrative context. I do see that more in some supplements now. And this approach can add a verse-appropriate element of obfuscation and unpredictability regarding the true scope of conflict, allowing broader storytelling opportunities. But it can also be problematic, because with this option, without any established scale for battles consistently, there would undoubtedly be many who then are left feeling confused, even frustrated, as they attempt to piece together the significance of each conflict in that broader narrative of the verse. Without numbers or some sense of scale, planetary campaigns lose broader context and how it contributes to the overarching narrative. Without that sense of context, it's difficult to gauge the impact of victories and defeats, leading then to a loss of narrative cohesion and also emotional investment in characters as well as the outcome of the battles. Still, all of this does not address a more major issue, which is that no matter what approach is taken moving forward with the lore, it does nothing to redress the broad inconsistencies which already exist throughout 40k material historically. As I said earlier, adjusting things in the contemporary narrative to be of a scale that is more appropriate is all well and good, but will likely only end up emphasizing the fluctuating numbers of troops and war machines involved in past conflicts. And to solve this, I think ultimately you're going to need to see something similar to Chronostrife, some narrative storyline where we potentially see Roberto Guillermin looking into historical records of the Imperium and finding that records have been inaccurately recorded, perhaps some broad propaganda campaign purpose, or that in some instances there simply were no accurate numbers. Not to mention, of course, unreliable narrators, destroyed worlds which contained records, conflicting accounts of battles, the fog of war, but this approach would, to a degree, patch up past issues. And I think it would be good if we could see that in a singular story somewhere, something about that inconsistency or the major problems there not being recorded, because that would draw a line under it and we could move forward. It would maintain the integrity of the lore. And this could then be bolstered over time by supplementary materials referencing it, novels, codex entries, campaign books, which delve into maybe past specific battles and provide additional context and details, but maybe they were discovered millennia later. And all of that would help to flesh out the lore, fill in gaps, address inconsistencies. Now, while this topic for today, in some respects, can appear to be an unnecessary overthinking of the lore, I personally don't believe this to be the case, because I'm sure, like me, it's something that people talk about and reference and are frustrated by pretty consistently. And because continuity and coherence within a narrative is fundamental to the immersion and connection we have with characters and factions, without consistent, appropriate scale, those individuals and factions can appear to possess inconsistent levels of power and influence, and even the decisions they make from one story to the next, creating, again, bigger inconsistencies that can be then difficult to reconcile over time. And this detracts and it breaks the overall feel, for me, of the 40k verse. It's certainly true that ambiguity can be always used as a tool to minimize these kind of issues, or even to add depth and complexity. But it also has to be used specifically and sparingly to avoid confusion and inconsistency. You've got to strike that balance between the scale and horror of the 40k verse, which you need to hear and understand those numbers to get that, and the fog of war, the scale from individual to galactic campaigns which consume multiple systems. This is an extremely critical facet of the broader narrative and the verse. These things are only mentioned once or twice usually in a story or a campaign. The numbers are only referenced here and there, and they're details that can be seemingly easily dismissed or hand-waved. But they're not. They're critical components, which in many respects dictate the entire weight of the narrative. In a galaxy of war where humanity throws everything it has into the meat grinder, and for a verse that very often draws directly also from human history, it seems to me the only way to really bring the true horror of the Imperium and 40k galaxy is to at least ensure that the backdrop of scale and numbers of individuals deployed meets the minimal expectations for plausibility and maintains our consistent immersion in the grim darkness of the far future.